But this was a coup, the coup of January the 15th I'm talking about now. This was a coup that was championed and led by Kaduna Nzego, who happened to be from the southern part of Nigeria, then known as Eastern region at the time. So when that event happened and the northern soldiers, the northern military officers realized that this very coup that are taking the lives or led to the assassination of their leaders was championed by someone from the eastern part of Nigeria by the name Kaduna Nzegu. They decided to stage a comeback coup. So that comeback coup then was staged in July the 29th, 1967. And in that coup, someone by the name Aguiyi Ironsi, who had assumed the position as the head of state, the military head of state of Nigeria, was assassinated. And Aguiyi Ironsi was from the eastern part of Nigeria, where the person who championed or staged the very first coup, Kaduna Nzegu, came from. So this was a way of the northern military officers fighting back or avenging the assassination of their political leaders. But the assassination of Kaduna Nzegu, of Aguiyi Ironsi, did not end the entire violence. Rather than the violence ending at that point, it spread across the areas where civilians from the eastern region who were living in the northern part of Nigeria uh, existed. The environment where these people actually live. So the citizens, people who were from the northern part of Nigeria, citizens, civilians, and soldiers decided to launch violence against ordinary people, from the eastern part of Nigeria. So the killing continued, and children, women, anybody perceived to be from the eastern region, was attacked, violently by citizens of the northern part of Nigeria. So, and the person to my right here is General Yakubu Gowon. And General Yakubu Gowon was the head of state, was the military head of state at the time that the violence was going on. And then to my left here, he is Odumego Ojukwu, Lieutenant Colonel Odumego Ojukwu. Odumego Ojukwu was the eastern governor, was the military governor of the eastern region at the time that the violence actually broke out. So when Odumego Ojukwu realized that the lives of the people from his region, people who were under his control, were no longer secure, he asked everybody from the northern part of Nigeria and the other part of the country where violence was being used against people from eastern region to return to the eastern region. So that then led to mass migration of people from eastern region who were living in other parts of the country to return to the eastern region. And one of the consequences of that was that people didn't have access to accommodation because there was not enough houses or homes to accommodate those who were returning from there. So as a result, there were a lot of people who became homeless in that eastern region as a result of that. But then when of course, there were a number of agreements a number of meetings and conferences that were held in order to resolve these whole crises. One of which was the meeting that held in January 1967 at Aburi in Ghana. So at that very meeting, they agreed that the leaders of the eastern region could have the opportunity to gain access to the political system called confederation. right? The idea of having a political system called confederation was agreed upon in in Ghana at Aburi. But when the leadership of Nigeria returned, they changed the whole system. They did not fulfill the promise that they had made or the agreement that they had signed in Ghana, and that then upset Odumegwu Ojukwu, who was the leader of the Eastern region at that time. But when he realized that the government of Nigeria was not willing to, make any, change that would favor his people who were already going through homelessness, lack of access to food, lack of access to water and the likes, then the leaders of Eastern Nigeria decided to come together. In coming together, they decided or agreed to secede from the entire Nigeria. And at that point, on May the 30th, 1967, the birth of the Republic of Biafra was announced. And this is the region. This is where the Republic of Biafra is, this area shaded in green. And the other parts, as we can see, that's the north. We have the northern part of Nigeria, we have Western region, and we have Midwest uh, down here. So this is what Biafra the place that I would be speaking to or speaking about looks like at that time. And this is the same, it was in the same region where women and children were attacked violently by both Nigerian and their own, Biafran soldiers throughout the conflict that lasted for 30 months. So one of the things we could see the pictures here. These are two pictures suggesting people lacking access to food, lacking access to water. Lives of these people here are threatened by what I call starvation. Because the moment the war broke out, there was starvation. Starvation spread across the heartland of Biafra, and that starvation was caused by the blockade that was imposed on Biafra after its birth on May the 30th, 1967, by the Nigerian government. And one of the reasons why the Nigerian government imposed that blockade was to prevent the Biafrans from getting access to food so that very easily or quickly they would surrender and give up the idea of seceding from Nigeria. But unfortunately, the Biafrans, held on. They refused to give up. And in that light, the Nigerian government continued to enforce that blockade on Biafra, preventing food and other medicine and other key supplies that people needed to survive from entering into the enclave. So as a result of that, people started to fall sick. Children did not have access to food. Children didn't have access to water and medicine and life. And this is a consequence. This is part of the consequences of the blockade that was imposed on Biafra. Children dying, women falling sick, uh, amongst other impacts. And if that continues, we could see to my left here, this is also a photograph, showing elderly women standing and holding bowls, asking for food. These women do not look healthy. They look extremely worried. And the children also look worried. So, which then speaks to the continuing impact of the blockade um, that was imposed on Biafra. And to my left, to my right here, we see a photograph of two little boys holding lizards. Lizards in the pre-war era lizards in the pre-war era were, forbidden kinds of food. Nobody consumed lizards in the pre-war era in Igbo land or, uh, Biafra as it was at the time. But during the war, because people lacked access, to protein as a result of the blockade that had been imposed by the Nigerian government. Some humanitarian organizations, amongst them Joint Church Aid, popularly known as JCA, and the Red Cross, encouraged or advised Biafrans or people within the Biafran enclave to consume lizards because that would serve as an alternative source for protein. So as a result of that, lizards became extremely expensive in Biafra at that time. So, and that's why people were these children holding lizards. Maybe they wanted to sell, in order to get some money to feed themselves, amongst others. So, lizards that was not something that people would cherish or want to consume and the likes during the war became very expensive products or goods. And here is a picture, showing, part of the impact of the blockade or the starvation that people experienced, because the starvation prevented people from gaining access to food, medicine, and the likes. And there was also kwashiorkor, that spread across the Biafran enclave as a result of the conflict. So here is a man I interviewed in Imo State during one of the periods that I was doing my field work. And he confessed to me that he was one of the children who were affected by kwashiorkor in Biafra. And according to him, his siblings are much more taller than myself, but his own growth was stunted as a result of that kwashiorkor. So the war that happened in the 60s and ended in 1970 continues to have impact on some of the people who actually experienced it. And my informant is one of those that were affected by the violence. So we continue to see the impact of the blockade and how that blockade necessitated or led to the starvation and kwashiorkor, sicknesses, deaths, amongst other bad things that the people who lived or existed within the Biafran enclave witnessed throughout the 30 months uh, life life uh, lifespan of the conflict. So as the starvation kept killing people, people didn't have access to food and likes, the international humanitarian organizations like the JCA, the ICRC, Red Cross, um, Oxfam Canada, amongst other key organizations that were concerned, as well as church organizations, intervened, and they were bringing food, smuggling food, in short, from places like Sao Tome, Gabon, Lisbon in Portugal, into Biafra. But the problem was that the Nigerian government, in order to continue to ensure that the blockade was effective, continued to block those organizations from bringing food into Biafra. So as a result, even though the organizations were successfully brought in some food into Biafra, the food, medicine, and other key things that they smuggled were not enough to go around and serve the Biafran civilians. So to respond to that, women in the heartland of Biafra gathered themselves together and introduced an initiative known as Afia Attack. Afia in Igbo language is market, and the attack attached in front of Afia suggests the violence that characterized that market or trade engagements, led almost entirely by women from the heartland of Biafra. So what women would do during this trade would be to travel from Biafra around past 12 a.m., sometimes 1 a.m., 2 a.m. Some of them left 3 a.m. to places where war did not affect. Because in those places, people could farm and markets were running and the likes. So these women would travel, sometimes 10 of them, sometimes 20, sometimes 30, depending on those who were willing to risk their lives for food, for medicine, amongst the other things that people needed to survive. So women would get together and travel 2 a.m., 1 a.m., 2 a.m., 3 a.m. to those markets. And they would buy food and bring those foods to Biafra to feed themselves, to feed their children. And also they supplied parts of the food to some of the Biafran soldiers that were fighting to defend their their newborn republic, the Republic of Biafra. But one thing with this trade, and one of the key implications of this trade is that while women were traveling, a lot of them were killed. They were shot dead by Nigerian soldiers. Because while traveling, because this usually happened around 12, 12 after past 12, past midnight, 1 a.m., 2 a.m., 3 a.m. And they would have to cross borders. And along those borders, you had Nigerian soldiers waiting for Biafran soldiers. So while these women were passing through, unknown to them that Nigerian soldiers were hiding for them, and Nigerian soldiers unknown to, Nigerian soldiers not knowing that the people who were approaching were women, often confused these women for Biafran soldiers who were the main enemies. And without thinking too much, Nigerian soldiers would release bullets on these women. And as a result, a lot of these women, while going to those markets and while returning from those markets, lost their lives. And the picture here shows one of the women who engaged in that difficult, that, that trade that was characterized by violence throughout the war. So she was one of my informants during my research. This woman witnessed that violence, and in short, she knew people who lost their lives during those times when they would travel crossing the Biafran territory, the Biafran heartland, into those places where they bought food and coming back as well. But like I mentioned, despite all the violence that characterized the trade, the Hafia attack, the women did not give up on Biafra because they felt if they gave up and Biafra fell, they too would fall. So whatever happened to Biafra, they felt would also affect them. So as a result, all the food that, parts of the food that they smuggled into Biafra from those external or outside markets, they supplied parts of them to Biafran soldiers. And what that meant was that because Biafran soldiers could get access to food through the actions and the activities of women, those soldiers continued to engage Nigerian soldiers. And that did not go well with the Nigerian government because the initial plan of the Nigerian government was to use starvation to bring Biafra into submission. But due to the activities of these women, that became impossible. And we would see how this provoked the Nigerian government to the extent that women were bombed, women were physically attacked, and a lot of them lost their lives, through the support that they rendered to the Biafran state. And this photograph here, or this picture here, shows women, trying to supply food or delivers, while delivering some of the food that they brought into Biafra to in support of their soldiers. And if we look at this very picture also to my left here, we see women, sitting. Oftentimes, when those women brought the food and the supplies from those external markets, they would concentrate in forests or inside forests. Forests sometimes unknown to Nigerian soldiers or the Nigerian government. But those forests were known to Biafran soldiers because some of these Biafran soldiers, they were, sons to some of these women. They were husbands to some of these women. They were uncles to some of these women. They were nephews to some of these women. So the Biafran women felt a sense of responsibility or a sense of duty to their people, not just their people, those who were fighting with their family members. And if we look closely at this picture, we would see, we could see a soldier, someone standing here. That's a Biafran soldier who must have gone there to collect his share of the food and the supplies smuggled into Biafra to feed them by these women. So as the women were doing all these things, as I mentioned earlier, the Nigerian government became upset because those activities actually were, negated, or they had, they continued to have a negative impact on the war strategies or the war plans of the Nigerian government. So what the Nigerian government did first was to start to abduct these women. Wherever they were traveling to those markets, some of them were abducted. And in addition to that, some of those women were raped and sexually molested by Nigerian soldiers. And in some cases, Biafran soldiers also did the same. But what differentiated the experiences of women in the hands of the Biafran soldiers and in the hands of Nigerian soldiers was that the Biafran soldiers the Biafran government punished any Biafran soldier that was found, guilty of, rape or abduction or sexual molestation of their own women. But in the case of the Nigerian government, we do not have evidence that such happened. So those women, women in Biafra, due to, as a result of the contributions that they were making to the war effort of Biafra, they were abducted, they were raped, or sexually molested, and many of them were forced into marrying some Nigerian soldiers. And these are also some of my informants. They were amongst those who gave me, some of this information that I'm sharing with you today. So in addition to that, the first stage, women were abducted, they were sexually molested, they were forced into marrying Nigerian soldiers. That was the first response of the Nigerian government. The second response was seizure of the food that these women were bringing into Biafra. They would seize the food that those women were bringing into Biafra in order to prevent parts of the food from slipping into the hands of Nigerian soldiers. Because the Nigerian government realized that the more the Nigerian soldiers had access to food, the more they were able to withstand the firepower of the Nigerian soldiers, and the more they were able to continue to fight in that war. So what that was doing was to elongate the war beyond the periods that the Nigerian government had planned it would end, or had planned for it to end, right? So they seized a lot of food, and this woman right here that we see here was amongst those who fell victim of food seizures. So she also engaged in a mafia attack, and during one of those times when she was traveling back into Biafra, Nigerian soldiers laid ambush, and then they collected all the food that she was bringing into the Biafran enclave. And as a result of that, she told me that she cried throughout that day because her children could not gain access to food to eat on that day or for a whole week after that event. But those were not the only ways in which the Nigerian government responded. The Nigerian government also responded by bombing the homes where some of these women lived. And if we look closely to the background of this photograph, we could see that the home behind had been bombed. Perhaps maybe the husband of this woman who is crying here, had been killed. Maybe her children had been bombed to death, or maybe some of our properties also have been destroyed. But the point is that the Nigerian government responded violently by bombing homes, um, uh, raping women in Biafra, abducting women, and also forcing women into forced marriages. And as those homes were being bombed, a lot of these women became homeless. And these photographs that we see attest to that, to the fact that these people are homeless. They, I'm not sure, we cannot be sure that they knew where they were going because at this point, these photographs suggest that, their homes had been bombed and they were looking for another place where they could get safety and protection. So through the responses of the Nigerian government, a lot of these women and their family members became homeless in Biafra, and that contributed to the homelessness that we saw before Biafra was declared in 1967, on May the 30th, 1967. And lastly, the Nigerian government did not just bomb homes, but also they bombed markets where women were operating, because it was through those markets that Biafran soldiers, gained access to some of the foods that those women brought into the enclave. And if we look at these two pictures closely, we could see that these are women, trading at the time when the bombs were released by the soldiers, hires, majority of them Egyptian soldiers, Egyptian pilots, hired by the Nigerian government to conduct the bombing of markets across the heartland of Biafra. And these pictures actually attest to some of the damages done due to the activities or the bombing activities of the Egyptian Egyptian bombers. So when we look at everything that I've been describing to this point, we could see that yes, women were victims in that war, and that would not be the only war where women, were victims. Even some of the recent wars that we hear about today, the war happening between Israel and Palestine, the war happening between Russia and Ukraine, we see women feature prominently in them, as humanitarian victims. But in the case of Biafra, we had women as humanitarian victims. And at the same time, we had women as key actors in that war. Because without the support rendered by these women to the Biafran soldiers, the soldiers of Biafra would have collapsed, within few months of that war. Even Biafra might not have lasted for up to 1 month. But this was an enclave or a secessionist state that lasted for 2.5 years. And that, resilience displayed by Biafra cannot be understood or explained without the activities or the roles that women played in that. So as as far as we can categorize these women within the space of, humanitarian victims. They were equally, key actors. They also exerted their agency throughout the conflict. Thank you very much for the opportunity to present my research there. Thanks.
Okay. Yes, thank you for your presentation, Dr. Bello. And maybe we will, if you want to stop sharing your screen, then we can maybe see the gallery of people, and we'll now open the floor for questions. If you have a question online, you can raise your hand. I'll come to you. Any questions from people online or in the room? Maybe while people are waiting, I'll go ahead and ask a question. I'm kind of interested to know how much you would characterize this work that you're doing as a kind of nationalist history. It sounds a little bit like a nationalist history, but I'm not very familiar with it. So I say that because a kind of telling that emphasizes a kind of heroism, which definitely there seems to be heroism going on here. But then I wonder also about a couple of things. One, you did mention the Biafran soldiers, punishment for Biafran soldiers for violence committed against Biafran civilians. But I wonder about the balance of the account. So there were also Southerners living in the East who then fled, where there were similar acts of violence that went unpunished. I don't know if there were any incursions by the Biafran state into the Nigerian Republic, Federal Republic. And if so, did they commit similar kinds of violence? That would just be a question I would have as a kind of balance question. And also I was wondering about the motivations of the women. So the women are definitely, probably one motivation is to survive, right? They're getting food not only for the war effort, but also for their own survival. But those women who are contributing to the war effort, is it solely a kind of patriotic motivation, or did some of the women become wealthy or make money from the trade? So it was a trade. Was it a market? It was a trade, a market, as opposed to a kind of a, was it a more of a market or a humanitarian mission? That would be one question. A humanitarian mission might be about securing food and then giving it away or donating it at cost or something like that. But was there, I'm sure there were cases of price, where people were taking the temptation, the opportunity to make some money. So I don't know, that just qualifies, not to negate the kind of things that you're saying that happened, but just to put them in perspective. I wonder if you could comment on that.
Yeah, I mean, just thank you very much for those two questions. They are really important, actually. Thank you very much for that. So in terms of the trade, uh, before the war, the women were closely involved in the war from the beginning. They were concerned. Recall that, I mean, you would recall that many of them, they lost their children, they lost their husbands, they lost their family members in the northern part of Nigeria, and also Lagos, Ibadan, amongst other key places where Easterners existed. So when the war was about to happen, these women decided to pull all hands on the deck, all hands on the table. They supported the war effort from the beginning. In short, they formed organizations, and those organizations actually were the ones that supplied food to the Biafran soldiers and the Biafran governments. But you also had some of these women who felt, look, it is important that they helped their children to survive. They also helped themselves to survive, as well as helping the Biafran soldiers to survive. And as I mentioned, this was like a duty that must be fulfilled for these women because their family members were involved in that war. Their family members were part of, those who were fighting. So on the one hand, you had women who supported the war, wholeheartedly without thinking about, making financial gains. But at the same time, you had women who capitalized on the war and they made a lot of money from it, especially those who were able to smuggle into Biafra salt, because salt was very scarce in the Biafran heartland at that time. So those who could successfully smuggle salt into Biafra sold salt and they made a lot of money as a result of that. So on the one hand, we had people who were doing it for their family members, who were doing it for themselves, and also doing it for their husbands and the Biafran soldiers. And then we also had some who engaged in that trade in order to boost their pockets, financially. So that's how I would respond to the second question that you asked. But that very first one, yes, this is. I mean, we could say this is not a nationalist narrative, but as a way to balance it, because of time, I did not mention that as the violence was happening in the northern part of Nigeria, some people who felt aggrieved, who felt that their people were being killed, were also responding to the northerners who lived in eastern part of Nigeria. You are very correct with that observation. And the Biafran government did not do anything to them before the war. But during the war, those who were found to go against the principles or the laws of the land were punished, including those who were engaged in violence against women. And this has been, I mean, a lot has been written about this, especially by Sam Daly, who published a book in 2020 called The Republic of Biafra, the book that was published by Cambridge University Press. He talked about how the Biafran government responded to crime, including crimes against women at the time. But we did not see the same thing in the case of the Nigerian government. In short, even after the war had been called ended, had been declared ended, we still had some Nigerian soldiers who committed, acts of rape, abduction, and all from other forms of violence against, women and girls in, post-war Eastern region. And we still haven't heard anything about prosecution of those people. Till today, we don't know what the government did to any of them. But in the case of Biafra, there's a lot of evidence that the Biafran government responded to that. So this is how I would respond to it in terms of, balancing the whole narrative.
Thank you very much.
Okay.
We have a question from Ernestina online. Go ahead, please.
Thank you very much. It's
Thank
good.
you very much. Thank you.
It's good hearing the story from a scholar who have researched it. Most times when you hear people say it, it's like it doesn't make up for me, but hearing it with picture evidence gives me a very clear picture.
Thank you.
Now, my question is, if the people went to Ghana to sign the agreement, in your opinion, what would be the reasons or what were the reasons they gave to not following the agreements that they reached in Ghana when they returned? And also, this also emphasized the long-lasting relationship that has been between Ghana and Nigeria over the years.
Yes. Ghana played a very important role in ensuring that the misunderstanding did not generate into a major war, which unfortunately, it did degenerate into a major war. This was during the reign of General Ankara, if you would recall. I mean, for those who are familiar with the history of Ghana. So General Ankara was the one who invited Ojukwu and Yakubu Gowon to Aburi in order to discuss the problem that, the national crisis that was ongoing at the time. They did agree to form a confederation, meaning that the Igbo people, each region would be able to manage its resources, right? And then return maybe part of the money generated to the federal power, right? Which the federal government could then use for maybe infrastructural development, amongst other things, right? This was the arrangement. But after the delegates returned to Nigeria from Aburi in Ghana, there was a change of mind. The people within the cabinet of General Yakubu Gowon told him that, look, this is a path to secession. And one of the key people who raised that alarm was Chief Obafemi Awolowo. He made a claim that, look, in short, Chief Obafemi Awolowo was the one who gave the idea about this. Sorry, he was not a member of the what is it called? He was not a member of the cabinet at this time, but he later got appointed as the commissioner for finance during the war, and he was the one who introduced the idea of blockade on Biafra at the time. But the point that I'm trying to make is that immediately the cabinet members, the delegates, returned to Nigeria, they informed Yakubu Gowon that, look, if you give these people opportunity to control their own, this is like a path to secession. It would mean that each state would now have the power or the strength or the opportunity to compete with the federal government. And there were also rumors that some individuals also threatened the Gowon government that, look, if this is the case, then we are going to push towards secession, because the most important thing, for us is to unite this country. So if we are talking about unity, then we shouldn't be talking about confederation at this time, because the confederation of that time is not what we know confederation to be today. So as a result of that, Gowon changed his mind. So the Odumegwu Ojukwu went to him. In short, I had access to some of the letters written by Odumegwu Ojukwu to Yakubu Gowon, urging him to keep up with the agreement reached in Aburi. But Gowon did not respond as a result of, the change of mind, which was triggered by, some of his cabinet members. So the government failed to fulfill the agreement reached at Aburi. And that was why, the Biafrans decided to declare, the birth of a new nation known as the Republic of Biafra at that time.
So,
I have a question.
Yeah, Maximilian Chibuike. Yeah, if you can make it very quick. He says very quick. Then we have a question in the chat from.
Okay, thank you. I will make it quick. Yeah, thank you so much, Dr. Taiwo, for this informative lecture. In fact, I am one of the people that are being devastated as a result of the Nigerian Biafra war. My family, we lost 2 people. So considering that particular genocidal attack leveled against the people of Biafra as a nation then, so my question is there anything the international community is currently doing in order to, heal the land? Because I remember after the Biafra war, there was 3R that was established then to make everything here. the reconciliation, rehabilitation, and reconstruction. But unfortunately, as I was talking today, Nigerian government have failed to do that. So is there anything that the international community is doing to make sure that this genocidal attack leveled against the people of Biafra is being handled based on the things that have been said? Thank you.
Oh, thank you. Thank you very much for that.
Maybe I will just ask Dr. James Yeku if he wants to voice his question, because I think it's relevant to this question. So maybe we take them both. So yeah. James, speak your question, or should I just read it?
I have seen Dr. Yeku's question. I mean, Dr.
Okay,
Yeku,
yeah, he's driving. So yeah, he's just,
Dr. Yeku, don't worry. I have your question in front of me, and it is closely related to Maximilian's question, about whether this was genocide, right? Dr. Yeku is asking whether this was genocide. That is one of the things that I'm grappling with in my current book. At first, I tried to avoid that because I didn't want to get into that debate. But at the same time, in one of my forthcoming articles, I argued that, look, what happened in Biafra could not be termed genocide, but a war crime. A lot of scholars have argued, yeah, this was genocide because of the bombing or whatever. But if we look at some of the wars that are going on around us, part of the things that I described in my talk are currently happening. If we think about Palestine, we think about Israel, we think about Ukraine or Russia and the likes. People were being bombed. Children were dying and the likes, right? And genocide is a term that is much more stronger. And when we put it side by side with what happened in Biafra, of course, people were bombed and the likes. The event did not qualify as genocide because the Nigerian soldiers or the Nigerian governments had access to some individuals from Biafra. In short, some Nigerian soldiers were dating Biafran women during this war. Some Biafran women, in short, some of them were courting. Some Biafran women would travel all the way from Biafra to the camps of Nigerian soldiers, and they would have interactions here and there. So it wasn't that the Nigerian government was going everywhere and just killing people or whoever they saw in Biafra during the war, they just killed that person. No, that was not the case. And also the Nigerian government did not put or poison the water that people were drinking in Biafra. They knew where people existed. They didn't poison those things. So the goal was not to exterminate, to kill everybody that they saw, because there were even what's his name now? Nnamdi Azikiwe. So sorry, I'm so sorry. Nnamdi Azikiwe even had to cross carpet from Biafra to Nigeria in 1968. But it was not killed. It was not destroyed. So the goal of the Nigerian government was not to exterminate or destroy anything Igbo or anybody Igbo, or anybody Biafra, because we still have some people some Igbo people who were serving within the Nigerian government. What is it called? Nigerian government ministries or organizations, and amongst others. So the conversation about genocide is not. I would argue that there was no, what happened was not genocidal, and this was also confirmed by the international committee that was sent into Biafra to investigate the case of genocide. Right? They came back and they wrote a report that yes, truly, people were bombed, homes were destroyed, people died, but these are parts of the consequences of war. And they came to conclusion that there was no genocide happening in Biafra. And from my own research so far, and also, based on the conversations that I had with the people that I interviewed, some of them even confirmed to me that, that could not be described as genocide. But in terms of what the international organization is doing about this, I haven't seen any step, being taken to address this. In short, the Nigerian government, the successive governments of Nigeria have not done anything as well, right? And recently, we heard President Buhari also addressing these people that, look, if you want war, we are going to give you war, something like that. That's not how to erase the memory of the violence that people experienced, in that, during the conflict, right? So in terms of whether the international organization is doing something, or especially the United Nations or whatever, I haven't seen any evidence that they are doing anything to address that. And that is why we keep having, the reoccurrence of that violence, with IPOB now, fighting, right? They are still fighting. We have ESN, we have other, smaller splinter groups, still fighting for the comeback of the Republic of Biafra, right? So the Nigerian government has to do something to address this. International organizations have to do something to address this, but it doesn't seem like anything is being done at this time. Thank you very much.
So I think with that, we're at the end of our time for this session. It was a very interesting session. Thank you so much for everyone who joined us online. Thank you for people who joined in person. Our next installment of the Ujamaa Virtual Colloquium Series is happening in February 26th. So please be on the lookout for that. Dr. Gladys Mongi from Johnson County Community College will be discussing some of her research. And this was great, Dr. Bello. Thanks for sharing your research. It's a very important issue. I think there are a lot of questions that we can still continue to ask about some of the things you brought up. What would constitute, what sort of actions could one do that would, help to kind of reconcile or get towards some sort of justice. Those questions are important not only for Biafra and Nigeria, but Africa in general and the world in general. Thank you very much for raising them.
Thank you.
Hope that we see you soon in person, and I wish everyone a good week.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Thank you. Bye. Thank you.